The film opens with a man named Dan, a husband who deeply loves his wife, Mercy. However, as time passes, he begins to feel a distance growing between them. Their once warm relationship now feels stale. In fact, they haven't been intimate for a long time. In his confusion, Dan finally pours out his heart to his co-worker, Jay. He tells him that his marriage is on the rocks and he doesn't know what to do to fix it. One day, Jay comes up with a strange idea. He suggests something unreasonable. What if Dan tries to play with their boss, Mrs. Catherine? Of course, Dan refuses. He's confused about why his marital problems are being directed at something like this. He thinks Jay has overstepped his bounds. Instead of helping, he's offering increasingly complicated suggestions. But even more surprising, Dan discovers Jay keeps a photo of his mother. Dan is puzzled and asks why. Jay explains that Dan's mother resembles his own mother, so he just keeps it for fun. This reasoning sounds strange and doesn't make sense to Dan. Despite this, Dan continued to try to save his marriage. He tried to contact Mercy, but was at a loss for words. It felt like nothing could keep their relationship alive. Sometime later, Catherine called Dan into her office. Unexpectedly, she flirted with him and invited him to be intimate. Dan was initially shocked, but then he became trapped in the situation. After the incident, Dan told Jay everything. His friend was shocked. How could Catherine, the woman idolized by so many people in the office, choose Dan? A new problem arose. Dan was at a loss for how to hide his mistake from Mercy. He began to think, maybe he should just be honest and admit everything. Unexpectedly, Catherine turned out to be Mercy's friend. They even met at a cafe and talked about relationships. That's when Dan had a crazy idea. If he was cheating, then Mercy should do the same, to balance things out. Dan then asked a famous actor named Rick for help in getting closer to Mercy. The ridiculous idea was accepted. Rick began courting Mercy by giving her flowers at her office. However, the attempt didn't go smoothly, as Mercy didn't seem easily charmed. Meanwhile, Catherine called Dan again to try to get intimate again. Luckily, this time Dan came to his senses and successfully refused, then left the room. One night, Dan came to Jay's house to ask for advice. However, Jay seemed busy and postponed the conversation until the next day. There, Dan heard a voice that sounded like his mother's from inside the house. At first, he thought it was a hallucination, but it turned out to be true. Jay was having a relationship with his mother. This left Dan devastated and in disbelief. Afterward, Dan felt even more guilty towards Mercy. He didn't dare speak, but his heart wanted to be honest. He went back to Rick, hoping he would continue with his plan. But again, he failed, as Mercy wasn't the type of woman to be easily approached. Finally, on a night filled with regret, Dan plucked up the courage to confess to Mercy that he had made a big mistake. Mercy was shocked, but it turned out it was all part of the plan. She was the one who had asked Catherine to approach Dan in the first place. It turns out that both Dan and Mercy had the same idea. The difference was that Mercy's plan succeeded perfectly, while Dan was trapped in his own stupidity. Embarrassed, Dan decided to return to his parents' house and confide in his father. He said, "If your marriage is broken, and you're on the verge of separation, you're going to be a man." His father replied calmly, "Face it like a grown man. Differentiate between right and wrong, what's worth fighting for, and what's not." Finally, Mercy decided to divorce. The divorce papers were signed. But after everything happened, Dan realized he couldn't live without Mercy. He tried to fix everything and proposed to Mercy once again. Funnily enough, they eventually remarried and lived happily ever after. Of course, with a much stronger relationship than before, and of course, more passionate lovemaking than ever. And finally, the film ended.